Chapter 4. How to overcome the pleasure motive. We have said, unless the pleasure motive is overcome, no matter what else we do, we can never perfectly control the mind. This statement may give a rude jolt to many who struggle with their minds, but it is a statement of fact, and the implications of this fact need to be grasped. It is easy to say bluntly that unless the pleasure motive is renounced, one cannot have a strong will to control the mind. But the pleasure urge, being elemental in us, is so deeply ingrained in our flesh and blood that it can be got rid of, if at all, only with the greatest difficulty. We must not, however, complicate our inner situation by imagining that we are wicked in seeking pleasure. The pleasure motive is not in itself sinful, though, of course, indulgence in immoral pleasures which create greater bondage and retard our higher self-development is. Except for a microscopic minority who, in response to a higher call, have renounced worldly pursuits and about whom we are not speaking here, except for them, life itself will hardly be possible without some satisfaction of the pleasure urge. What to live for, if not for pleasure, will be the honest question of the majority of mankind. This urge is a living force in man and a force by which he lives. Yet it is true that the pleasure motive eats away our will to control the mind. What then is the solution of this inner problem? To be sure, ascetic denial is not the answer for the vast majority. Neither is the answer indulgence. The answer is in gradually educating our pleasure urge and in understanding the dimensions of our own being and how to harness the pleasure urge for the purpose of self-fulfillment. This will need some elaboration. Incidentally, it is as well to make it clear that we are now discussing a general problem that faces beginners who are worldly in their dispositions. For those who are advanced aspirants, some of the points we are going to discuss will not hold good. They will know what these points are. For example, the enjoyment of legitimate sense pleasure is permissible for the ordinary person who has yet to make a start in spiritual life, but not for the person who has taken several steps in it. Don't seek pleasure is hardly a practical precept for anyone who has a pronounced craving for pleasure in his nature. The illumined teachers of India, besides being knowers of truth, were masters of human psychology and compassionate preceptors. What they taught on this subject can be put in a few words. Seek pleasure, but in a way which will not spoil your physical or mental health or obstruct your higher development. If you must seek physical pleasure, seek them in such a way that your powers may be preserved for enjoying the joys of the mind. Seek the joys of the mind in such a way that your powers may be preserved for attaining the bliss of the spirit. Do not seek pleasure in a way that will destroy you. This should make sense to thinking people. Ethical principles, the observance of which is helpful in controlling the mind, are all meant to protect a man from harming himself. Thus they serve his profoundest interest. The wild pleasure urge has first to be domesticated in the frame of the requirements of self-development before it can be ready for graduation. What do we mean by graduation here? Sri Ramakrishna teaches. There are three kinds of ananda, joy. The joy of worldly enjoyment, Vishayananda. The joy of worship, Bhajanananda. And the joy of Brahman, Brahmananda. The joy of worldly enjoyment is the joy of sense objects which people always enjoy. The joy of worship one enjoys while chanting the name and glories of God, and the joy of Brahman is the joy of God vision. After experiencing the joy of God vision, the rishis of olden times went beyond all rules and conventions. By graduation we mean passing from one of the above kinds or levels of joy to one above. We must remember that the joy of Brahman is attainable by man, not only theoretically, but actually. A firm faith in this truth is necessary for graduation in pleasure seeking. Seek sense pleasure, Vishayananda, if you must, then, but in a way which does not run counter to gaining the joy of worship, Bhajanananda. This can be done through developing the habit of discrimination and being discriminating in the sense pleasures you seek. Sri Krishna teaches in the Gita, and experience corroborates, that all contact-born happiness is productive of misery. To remember this even while enjoying sense pleasures will develop the habit of discrimination. Then it will be easier for a person to seek sense pleasure within the frame of moral discipline, which is meant to preserve him for enjoying the highest bliss. Along with this, he should engage in suitable forms of spiritual discipline which are conducive to the joy of worship, Bhajanananda. Gradually, as his mind gets more and more purified, his interest in sense enjoyment will be less and less, and his interest in the joy of worship will increase proportionately. A time will eventually come in the life of the person who sincerely struggles on in this way, when he faces the necessity of setting aside even the joy of worship and becoming a firm seeker of the Supreme Spirit. It is one thing to seek the benefits of seeking God, and quite a different thing to seek God for his own sake, benefit or no benefit. When the seeker has inwardly grown to the extent of seeking the Supreme Spirit for its own sake and for no other motive, then his desire for pleasure will have been sublimated, and this will be conducive to perfect control of the mind. Sri Ramakrishna teaches, when does the attraction of sense pleasure die away? When one realizes the consummation of all happiness and all pleasures in God, the indivisible eternal ocean of bliss. Those who enjoy Him can find no attraction in the cheap, worthless pleasures of the world. He who has once tasted the refined crystal of sugar candy finds no pleasure in tasting dirty treacle. He who has slept in a palace will not find pleasure in lying down in a hovel. The soul that has tasted the sweetness of divine bliss finds no happiness in the vulgar pleasures of the world. Many well-meaning but misdirected aspirants struggle with their desire for pleasure in a wrong way. In their earnestness, they do not hesitate even to do harm to themselves, but it is all in vain. Ultimately, they are vanquished, notwithstanding their honesty of purpose and sincerity. So it is very important to avoid this pitfall in handling the problem of our inner life, the desire for pleasure. Sri Ramakrishna teaches a helpful way. On being asked when the enemies of man such as lust, anger, etc. would be vanquished, the Master replied, so long as these passions are directed towards the world and its objects, they behave like enemies. But when they are directed towards God, they become the best friends of man, for they lead him to God. Lust for the things of the world must be changed into hankering for God. The anger that a man feels towards his fellow men should be turned towards God for not revealing himself. One should deal with all the passions in the same manner. These passions cannot be eradicated but can be educated. What Sri Ramakrishna appears to mean by passions cannot be eradicated but can be educated is that the passions cannot be destroyed but can be harnessed and purified. If we direct our passions to lower things, we remain on a lower level. By linking them to higher objectives, we rise higher. If we link them to the Supreme Spirit, by their driving force, we rise to Him. And they, on the other hand, are educated and purified, and cease to be passions in the ordinary sense. After a person has experientially known that he is the Atman, and not the body-mind complex, passions cease, for passion is simply desire wrongly oriented. In other words, desire can be a friend or a foe according to the direction we give it. When desire is directed towards reality, it becomes the instrument of liberation and joy. When it is directed towards the unreal, it becomes the instrument of bondage and misery. Vedanta traces the pleasure motive in man to his metaphysical root, Ananda or bliss, the ultimate fact of existence from which man is essentially non-different. The Upanishad teaches, that which is known as the Self-Creator is verily the source of joy, for one becomes happy by coming in contact with that source of joy. Who indeed will inhale and who will exhale if this bliss be not there in the supreme space within the heart? This one indeed enlivens people. Certainly all beings here are indeed born from bliss, Ananda. Having been born, they remain alive by bliss, and on departing, they enter into bliss. The very root of man's existence being bliss, it is but natural that he should instinctively seek to feel identified with it. But when he is ignorant and is identified with body and mind, he seeks it ignorantly in the body and mind, and not where it is, in the spirit. This wrong seeking of bliss in a wrong place gives rise to our pleasure motive and its resultant bondage. As we have said before, bliss, Ananda, is not pleasure. It is beyond pleasure and pain, which can never be separated on the physical and mental plane. It is man's essential nature that urges him to seek bliss, and after much striving and fitful seeking of it on the material and mental planes, in the limited, man ultimately discovers it within his very self, the Atman, which is unlimited, being identical with the Supreme Spirit. He then realizes the truth of this teaching of the Upanishad. In the infinite alone is bliss. There is no bliss in the finite. To come to know this fact, man must learn at one stage that bliss is different from pleasure and pain, and that to attain it he must control his mind and give his pleasure motive a higher direction.